senior ontologist with Semantic Arts. So welcome to the GIST Council. Today, sounds like somebody is getting some weird sound feedback. Oh, okay. And so today we're going to look a little bit at one of the classes that we typically know we need, and yet the approach to how we actually use it sometimes confuses people a little bit. So we're going to dive into the temporal relations. So before we get into that, does anybody have any questions about the council in general, or what we're gonna do? Let me get my.
Am I alone in hearing some kind of weird,
like music or
music?
Yeah.
Somebody's got their.
Everybody should mute. I'm hearing it also.
I hear it too.
Everybody should mute.
Okay. That helps a lot. So, oh, now it's put it on the wrong slideshow. Sorry, I should. Let me pick a different share now. Okay. Good. All right. Now we're all clean and clear, hopefully. So, all right. So we're going to dive into using the temporal relation class. Sometimes, you know, right now, there we go. So sometimes we'll have a direct one-to-one relationship between two things. That's just the way we're thinking of them in the real world. But that relationship, when you put it into RDF, is not really sufficient to convey everything you need to know here. So in our example, on the right, Joe owns this Tesla, but has he always owned it? Since he was born, will he own it forever? There's just some missing information here. We need the temporal information about this relationship. So for that, we have in GIST our temporal relation class. And so a temporal relation, as its name implies, will have a start date or date time. It will have an end date or date time. We might not know one or either of those at any given moment, but in the open world assumption, that's fine. We understand that it's the nature of a temporal relation to have a start and an end, but we might not know exactly what those are. At one client's in their ontology, I kind of took a step of creating a super class of temporal relation called complex relation, but it's like, oh, okay, those will be the ones where you don't have a start and an end time, and then later realized, well, that was kind of pointless. Because of the open world, the temporal relation class will handle everything that I wanted. So, no extra thing is necessary. But the key point that we're going to focus on today is that a temporal relation must have at least two participants as part of it. And as I said, we're going to focus on that last point. So having two participants, for example, with an employment temporal relation, the employer and the employee are the participants in that relation, covering some period of time where the employee is working for the employer. Some multi-party temporal relations, ones where you've got more than two participants going on, might require more than one temporal relation instance. Things can get kind of inky. So like if you think of a multi-partner law firm, the firm as a partnership exists over a certain period of time, but the individual partners may come and go, and they'll have different start and end times. So sometimes you're going to have to resort to something probably involving multiple temporal relations, but we're not going to get into that today. I just wanted to raise that caution. The important thing to also note is when I'm using that word participant, that does not imply agency on the part of the participant, just that they're participating in the relationship. So non-sentient entities can be participating in these relationships. And the example that I just kind of gave and that we're going to be using through the rest of this deck, it includes a car as a participant. The Joe owns this Tesla, and the Tesla is not sentient, no matter what Elon Musk might assert. So usually when we are going to create a temporal relation, we are turning a noun or a verb into a noun. In this case, we're changing owns into ownership. And we call this action on our part reification. We have found in our own work that adding an annotation that we call reifies property can be very useful. So you can put it on one of these classes and then have an it gives you a little more clue as to what's going on with that class. And we'll also note that finding the noun that matches the property you are reifying is not always easy. It sometimes takes a lot of talking through before you kind of reach either the aha moment of, oh, this is what it should be, or settling on something that sounds kind of clunky but serves the purpose. But it's if anything, that's probably the hardest part of this whole process. So when it comes to actually using the temporal relation class, at one time I thought it would be really smart for me to create some generic properties that I could use over and over again with the temporal relation, and thereby avoid adding extra properties into my ontology, which, adding a lot of properties is something we try to avoid in our semantic arts modeling style. And so I thought I would be very clever and come up with these very generic relationships that I could use over and over again. And you can see those here. Their utility was not very good in practice. If you use a triple with has rel object as the property, for instance, that's very hard to look at as a human and understand what's going on. So it when I had created a bunch of these things and then looked at them, I was having to stop and build a mental model for every single triple to make sure I was correctly picturing which way the arrows were going, which way the verbs were pointing. It was just not very good. And then the more important thing is those properties have no semantic meaning at all. It tells you something about the modeling pattern, but nothing about the data itself. So I was like wiping out the semantic meaning behind this thing. So bad move on my part. But that said, it is still a useful pattern. It's useful for instruction, which we're doing today. I've used this with some colleagues when they come on board to help explain this sort of thing. So I've kept that around, but I do not put those properties, these notional properties, into an actual ontology anymore. I will note with this this pattern, because we're going to be seeing this through a lot of these slides, that the color coding that I'm using here has no meaning beyond just providing a visual clue that's useful, again, from the human standpoint. So the blue and solid arrows indicate left to right, and the red and dashed arrows indicate right to left. That's all that's being conveyed by the color coding here. But again, it's a useful thing to have. So going back to our example, we're going to reify the property owns into an ownership class. And this ownership class will be a subclass of temporal relation. I've meant to add in a slide and forgot to do it, to say, generally speaking, you are going to want to be creating subclasses of temporal relation. It's pretty rare, if ever, that you would want to absolutely assert that something is an instance of just temporal relation, because again, that's not a semantically meaningful class name, especially. It's kind of true, but it's not. It doesn't convey a lot of meaning to from the human perspective. So you're better off creating these subclasses of temporal relation and minting your instances on those particular subclasses. So in this case here, we're asserting that by reifying the property of owns, we're now saying that the ownership that Joe has over this car has a thing. It's a thing in its own right. It's got its own IRI. There are multiple things we can assert about it, like the start and stop date, which of course we want on a temporal relation. But we can also have other information like the ownership is titled under the jurisdiction of some particular government. Now we've got an additional party or an additional entity participating in this temporal relation. But in this case, I would not necessarily say really that the state of New York is a participant in the ownership. I in my mind, I'm still thinking of just Joe and the Tesla as being the participants in the temporal relation. You might have a slightly different view on that and think of the state of New York as being a participant. So where I'm going with that point is just be very careful and explicit about your use of the terms when you're explaining something like this to any of your clients or users. Now, the properties that I used in the prior slide, as we look over here, Joe holds the ownership of the ownership has its IRI ownership JKL, and the Tesla is owned via that ownership. The choice of those properties kind of indicates a point of view. But it's not the only way you can model that, as you saw from the original pattern. So other properties representing different perspectives can be used. So we can say, the ownership is the ownership of the vehicle, or the ownership is held by Joe. So just think to yourself, which of these patterns would you prefer to use? Which kind of is the easiest, but hold that thought, because we're going to circle back to it later in the presentation. So as I said, in my initial ill-formed enthusiasm, I actually added those generic properties into my client's ontology, and I hang my head in shame over doing that. don't do that. But as I noted, it can still be useful to think of certain properties as being sub-properties of these notional, very generic properties. Because doing that helps you to envision or ensure the idea of completeness. And what I mean by that is that semantically speaking, a statement involving a temporal relation is complete when that temporal relation instance has at least one connecting relationship to its relation subject and at least one connecting relationship to its relation object. So as long as you've got some complete path between all three of those things, then you're good. So just reiterating that statement there. So the predicate directions, which way they're flowing, do not matter so much so long as you have the complete set, something linking all three entities together. So in this little slide here, I'm just sort of showing different statement sets with different combinations of the arrows going left and right and right and left. And then giving a restatement of that using the example material from the previous slides. I, in fact, have something very much like this on the corkboard behind my monitor. So when I'm dealing with a temporal relation, I can just pop up and see the my various choices. So before we go on, are there any questions so far? I assume somebody will let me know if there's a hand up.
There are no hands up. There's been a couple of comments in the chat. One, maybe a car registration is a better example for this split. I think that one was a little bit ago. And then Matt Johnson, I think there's a connection to events. Any relationship is affected by a minimum of one event. An event is also related to time and has its own kind of participants, but this gives more space for placing properties correctly.
That is probably true. But you may or may not have access to the event data.
That's definitely true, Dan. And
Yeah.
I don't want to, but similarly, just if I want to use my inference engine to kind of back into, I can infer that if I can explicitly say there's a relationship between, say, myself and my wife, I can infer there's an event that actually affected that. And by effect, that could be create, it could be destroy, it could be whatever. So from an inferencing point of view, this is kind of one of those places where you might say the temporal object has min 0. So the inferencing engine is not going to catch anything, but just from a definitional point of view, any relationship comes from an event, at least one event. And conversely, every event where you have explicit data about events, you can infer this event probably had some effect on 0 or more relationships. Just so from a definitional point of view, I think there's a connection between temporal. Now, whether you say an event is a temporal object, that's a different question. But I think there is semantically, there's a connection between events and temporal objects, which is useful.
And Doug's got his hand up now.
Dan, when you're talking about semantic completeness, you talk about the minimum of two participants in the temporal relation. Does completeness include anything about the date, which kind of that's a segue from the previous caller's question.
Right. Yeah. In order to prevent cluttering up the slides, I've actually kind of left out the date information. So we're just sort of take it as read that somewhere here there's also start and stop date information on the temporal relation. But that does not factor into the completeness thing, in part because the start and stop dates are treated as literals. their data properties. And so, there's not there's not a necessary relationship here. But if we go back to this one where we're talking about the ownership is titled in this jurisdiction, if we did not have that statement that the ownership is titled there, we would still have a complete a complete set of statements as far as the temporal relation goes, because we are linking the participants, Joe, and the vehicle in together with the ownership. So those three components are all linked. So there is a complete statement there. And now that I'm actually saying this out loud, that kind of points out the distinction between the state of New York is probably not actually a participant in this, because if you were to take away the Tesla out of that statement and just have Joe, the ownership, and the state, you'd have a very incomplete picture of what's going on. So Joe holds an ownership that's titled in New York, but you don't know anything about that ownership other than when it started. So so that might help clarify your concepts of who's a participant in a complex relation.
But the state of New York will be happy to take your money anyway, even if you don't have a car.
Yes.
Michael's got his hand up.
Yes, going back to slide 10, Dan.
Okay.
You said you're hanging your head in shame because you thought, in retrospect, you felt this was a bad idea. However, it does have one possible use. If you want to infer who the original relationship, in other words, if you want to infer that Joe owns the Tesla, you need to know the direction. And if you had those sub-properties as ownership of, then you could have one single inference Sparkle query that could determine once and for all. You wouldn't have to remember each property chain and keep track of which book goes in which direction. That's a possible use. Not to use them directly, but to have the sub-property thing.
Yeah, I was gonna mention the same thing. I've actually found it to be useful to have that those super properties in order to be able to build property chains based on the fact that I've made that assertion kind of higher up. It is from a definitional point of view. It's I think I agree with you at the very beginning that if you just start with those generic and you only have those generic has rel object and rel object via, that's actually not super useful, because it might be meaningful for you who's actually writing the ontology, but anybody who's reading it, it's not actually very useful. So you do need all those kind of the holds ownership and stuff. But I've found that the super properties are actually useful for the reason that Michael just said.
Yeah, that is true. And you might have reasons for not wanting to put a domain or range specifically on the real properties that you want to keep, but having that that domain or range on these notional properties buys you that inferencing. So
right. I'll stop here, but I think the slippery slope that I've never been able to figure out is that you start looking at the names of these subproperties and they imply a role. It has participants, so they imply something, and so you start seeing is subject of, and so you kind of start the slippery slope is you start building a class called subject or whatever's kind of or owner. That's a better one. Holds ownership, so you start building a class called owner. And then you start trying to actually build your ontology so that it's fully complete, and you have a zillion different things, and you've kind of lost track of, well, wait, what are my requirements? Do I need these things?
Yes, exactly. So in a way, that's why it's kind of useful to go back to that first thing where we say Joe owns the Tesla. And then it's like, okay, we're going to reify that one thing, but we don't really need to start expanding out and creating extra classes for a class of owner and a class of owned thing. And, as you say, then you're getting into things, are these even requirements that I need? Probably not.
John's got his hand up. Let's see if your mic's working a little better. You're on mute. He did put in the chat, I don't know if this is, he mentions in the chat a bitemporal relations subclass or effective date versus as recorded date. And then there's a link to a bitemporal modeling page.
Okay.
So what's the question?
Or maybe it was just an observation.
Yeah.
I haven't looked at the link, but the one thing I was going to mention, this might be related to what John is saying, is that the thing that has held me back sometimes with the temporal relation is the genericness of the has start date and has end date, because there are, what I'm just reading John's comment here about effective date versus as recorded date, is that there are a tremendous number of possibilities of kind of dates that apply to a temporal relation, depending on the domain you're in.
Yes.
And so to some extent, the has start date, has end date. At first, it actually seems, as a pattern, it's actually really useful, but in some cases, it's actually too simplistic.
Yeah, there are. It is the case, with some of my own client work that we've created additional date time properties to be more specific and be more meaningful in their context. But we can't cover everybody's different context in the time allotted here. So but I should have pointed out that that is true. Sometimes it's better to either come up with a specific date time thing, or as noted earlier, there may be an event associated with this, and the nature of that event may give you the more specific time context.
Yeah, John added that, many temporal relations can be in fact bitemporal when a check is deposited versus when it clears. It's not universal, but it's quite common and generic. Maybe consider including as a standard gist class.
Okay. All right, so let me.
And then Rebecca and Michael both have hands up as well.
Okay.
Okay, two things. Just in relation to the comment that was just made about dates. Most date times that apply to temporal relation that you would want to define in your ontology, for example, issue date and expiration date, would be sub-properties of start date time and end date time. So that's not really an issue. Second thing I wanted to say, though, about your general predicates. So owns as a predicate has a direction, right? It has a subject and an object. A person owns something. But to me, the class ownership has no direction. It's a relationship. It's a relationship between two things. They're with no implication about which is the subject and which is the object, and therefore these predicates is subject of rel, is object of rel, make no sense.
It is, that is true. That is true, but in the idea that if your temporal relation is reifying some other property, then there would be a direction associated with that property. And so in that sense, you've kind of, that's what I was kind of implicitly building into those generic names.
Well, but if you had an inverse, it would also reify that inverse. So if you had is owned by, it would reify that as well as owns. So that, further suggest that it doesn't. And also, is there a formal way of stating that this reifies a certain relation to property? I don't think so.
No, you can.
Yeah.
We've added an annotation in, over in Morgan Stanley to say, this this temporal relation reifies
Okay.
property such, but it's an annotation. Nothing
There is no
else.
formal, because there is no formal way of doing that. So you cannot say ownership reifies owns, but not is owned by.
Right.
You know, again, that sort of is confirmation of my point.
Yeah.
Well, a couple of things about dates. So Matt raises the point that there are a number of dates, and that's true. However, fundamentally, what a temporal relation is a relationship that holds between two things over a period of time. So fundamentally, there's always two dates that must be there to have a complete set. And yes, there may be other dates, which is fine, but there always has to be two, and so those two are the key two. So that's one point. Secondly, in response to Rebecca's point, I believe that her position is in direct conflict with the experience of Matt and with my point. There is meaning to has-rel relation and has-rel object and has-rel subject. It gives you the direction. But Rebecca is also correct to point out that it's arbitrary. If you decide to reify owns instead of is owned by or vice versa, then has-rel subject and has-rel object flips. But they are useful for the reasons that Matt stated in his direct experience.
Yeah, because if you have the inverse, then the owned thing is now the subject.
Right, so then it makes no, sorry, but you can't then say is subject of, is object of, and
Well,
also.
if your triple is the Tesla is owned by Joe, the Tesla is now the relation subject.
I
And
know,
Joe is the relation object.
But ownership by itself does not, as we said, it cannot formally reify either one, and therefore to me is non-directional. Yes, you can specify more specific predicates like is owner and is owned thing, but in terms of subject and object in pure terms, there is none. Second thing, just to avoid any confusion, I wanted to follow up on what Michael said about dates. You may not actually have an end date in a temporal relation, right? So it's the open work. I mean, because it's an ongoing relationship. So there's
yes, it's true. It didn't end per se, but if it's ongoing, then now is it held for the period of time from when it started till now, and that's moving every moment. I mean, that's kind of a theoretical semantic point, but
that seems odd to me.
It is odd.
Because you don't want to say, so a marriage is a temporal relation. I wouldn't want to say, if I'm married right now, I wouldn't want to say my marriage ended today.
That's true. That's true. Fair point.
That's like answering, if someone asks you, are you married? You say, so far.
Yeah, my marriage is actually ending every day.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I retract. I'm hang my head in shame.
Pete Rivet put in the chat, have you thought about temporal data properties, for example, a change of name?
What does that mean?
So in this sense, I'm going to stick with these terms in spite of Rebecca's objections. So, where a person and their name would have a temporal relation. Is that what you're asking? And then
I think it actually makes sense. I've used in my own, just, and this is, you can take this to the nth degree of, if you take this to the nth degree, everything is a temporal relation. Matt Johnson, believe it or not, my hair used to not have gray in it. And so, and who knows, my wife, she's the same person. She had a different name before we got married and that kind of stuff. So I think the question there of, at what point do you take this pattern and you determine that, hey, this is a temporal relation versus this is just something you have to figure out. I might change my name, somewhere in here. And
all of that is driven by your requirements.
Yep.
Exactly.
I also meant to have a slide in here cautioning, that it is so easy to convince yourself, I'll do everything as a temporal relation. You know, and which it's like, oh, if you want to do that to yourself, fine, but you're also dragging probably all your users along and they're going to curse your name. So, you know, you only use these things when you really, really need them.
But I think there's also a difference between, you know, I know you guys tend to, when you approach a group, you're speaking in terms of like enterprise ontology, so that definitional sense. And there's a subtle difference. You go back to conceptual models, logical models, physical models, and from a definitional sense, everything is temporal. And as you just said, you have to go back to your business and say, what are your requirements?
Yeah.
You know, do you need to know?
And I cannot count the number of times, you know, when working on requirements with a new group or new client, and I will ask, you know, do you need to know the temporal history of this relationship?
Right.
You know, or they, you know, people will go, you know, they'll say, oh, we want that, and you know, it's like, okay, are you sure? What will you do with that information? And you know, it's about, you know, half the time in that case, they kind of go, well, you know, we really don't. That's like, then, you know, maybe we ignore the, you know, the temporality in this case. So, all right. You know, are there any new questions or anything? I do want to kind of move along to the rest of the material, because I've got even more provocative stuff coming up.
Oh boy. All right.
Yeah.
Well, I'll hold the chat until you get through.
Okay. All right. So, having looked at all of this stuff, I do want to make kind of a recommendation on handling these things based on my own experience. So while, you know, I was just saying that the direction of the properties, you know, you know, is not important so long as you have a complete set to link everything up. There are other considerations you may want to keep in mind. Principally being that if you are going to be doing visualizations of your knowledge graph, some of the nodes involved here may, you know, may be participating in a lot of other things. You know, so certain organizations or geo regions, for instance, might be participating in hundreds, thousands, millions of triples. You would not want to make one of these high usage entities either the subject, you know, or the subject of your temporal relation triple, because when you do a visualization, you know, it's just going to barf all over your screen. So
Dan, how does it change? How does making a temporal relationship change it? If you say this organization owns this other organization.
well, what I'm going to where I'm going here is the recommendation that I have is to generally use the ownership, the temporal relation as the subject of your triples. You know, make
Right.
have the relations going out from that reification, because if
I see.
if I were visualizing Joe, you know, it kind of, you know, I have an easy way of eliminate, you know, ignoring the ownership or whatever. But
So you're
you know,
saying the
if
visualization favors incoming versus outgoing arcs, or vice versa?
I'm saying visualization favors outgoing.
Okay, that
typically.
makes perfect sense. Now I understand. Thank you.
And so yeah, so if you have a geo region of the United States, you typically want to minimize the number of outgoing relations from
Yes.
that, because
Got it.
you know it would just be really ugly. So for that reason, you know, I favor this particular pattern for the temporal relations.
Makes sense.
All right, so now we're getting into some new stuff, and I'm going to be I want to preface that everything I'm going into from this point on is a personal opinion or idea of mine. This has really not been put through the ringer of the broader semantic arts ontological community. But one of the places where a temporal relation can come into play is with the use of roles. Now, within semantic arts, we generally try to discourage using roles. Dave had written a blog post and a white paper, as you can see, quite a while ago, a dozen years ago. And yet, the rationale underpinning those of why you want to avoid roles still remains valid. So it's a thing that we approach with great caution. But sometimes, dang it, you do have to deal with roles. So the semantic pattern that I encourage using, and again here I'm saying I because we haven't run this through our internal gauntlet. We want to make a distinction between a responsibility and a role. So I will note that it's my opinion that it is never proper to assign a role directly onto a person or organization because this person or organization, which I'm just going to call agent here, may perform that role only for some period of time, temporality. And without temporality, you only know who is currently performing the role related to their responsibility. Or without temporality, you may have out-of-date data, indicating that somebody is performing a role when they stopped doing that a while ago. And you may need to keep these historical or temporal data. And in those cases, you cannot add or delete relationships as the role is assumed and dropped. You have to have that temporality. Putting the role directly on a person or organization, you lose this. So, you can get and keep temporality using a responsibility class, which is would be a subclass of temporal relation. The other reason to not put roles directly on a person or organization is you lose the context. An agent may be playing different roles with different things. And if you're just saying, putting it directly on the person or organization and make it well nigh impossible to tell in what context they're doing these roles. So, for example, if we had a triple that said Dan has role teacher, okay, but since when has he been a teacher? For how long? Whom does he teach? For what organization is he teaching? You don't know any of that. And then let's say we also put in, the triple, Dan has role of father. Now, if you say, what roles is Dan playing? Well, he's a teacher and a father. And again, it's like, really, to whom and which one? So you really need that. You need to reify something to avoid that ambiguity of putting the role directly on a person or an organization or any other thing that you could assert a role about. So for that, I posit it's good to have a responsibility class that's a subclass of temporal relation. And I also assert that it takes an active agent to perform a responsibility. So a person or an organization or some subclass thereof. And you can get into the question of, okay, is a software agent, is an active system or something, is that an agent because it's making changes and everything? That would depend on your context. So, I'm not absolutely asserting that that works with responsibility. That's a call that you can make. Also, the agent has a responsibility for something. That's kind of the nature of what a responsibility is. But when I say thing, I'm not evading or exaggerating. It is just the nature of responsibilities that it can cover a wide variety of concepts. So trying to narrow down the definition of what a responsibility can be about is probably a fool's game in general. In your own particular context, it might be something that you can scope to a particular thing, but in general, I just leave the idea of responsibility as potentially involving anything. And then, to execute the responsibility, then the agent assumes some sort of role. And I tend to treat a role as a subclass of gist behavior. And that, again, that's one of those things that I'm looking forward to talking about with my colleagues, because it might not belong there, but so far it's worked for me. So again, following the pattern that I had recommended before, you make the responsibility the center of your triples patterns, and so the responsibility is performed by some person or organization, or maybe you prefer something like is executed by this person or organization. That's again up to you, and the idea that the responsibility applies to something. And then, the responsibility is characterized as some role. Or, maybe you want to create a more specific property of your own, like has role. I've done that as well. Either of those work. And then, when you get down to brass tacks, you can look at something like here where, you have this particular account responsibility, some responsibility that applies to this account. This responsibility is performed by this person. It's characterized as acting as the custodian. So this party is the custodian on this account. It has a start time. Presumably one day would have an end time. But who made this party the custodian on the account? Well, it's this other party it was assigned by. So by doing this, you now can answer a variety of things about the role being performed, with no ambiguity, or I hope there's no ambiguity. And so now we're back to questions, which I'm sure people have.
Yep. Michael, first hand up.
Yeah, so Dan, I think this is quite interesting and largely useful and largely correct, although we'll obviously have some conversations about it. But one thing that struck me was, and this is just a question, is it accurate to think of a responsibility as a role being played for a period of time?
Yes.
Okay, that's what it looked like. Okay.
Right.
And so is performed by could be tweaked and called it plays role, or role played by, something like that. Fibo had something like that. They did a lot of role stuff.
Right.
Anyway, that's a small point, but thank you. I got the essence of it. I think it's a good idea.
Rebecca, next hand.
So what if you have a marriage as the temporal relation?
Okay.
So I'm not sure, first of all, that we can assign a responsibility.
Well, let's back up. Let's back up. What are the roles? What is the role that you're assuming is involved in this marriage?
Okay, spouse, let's say.
Okay.
So here's the thing. You have a marriage. In your top diagram there, you have a marriage in place of responsibility. And there are, let's say you wanted to do the old-fashioned thing and you wanted to say,
okay, well, hold on, let's back up. I think your premise is wrong.
okay.
So, let's say, the responsibility applies to the marriage. Joe is performing that responsibility, and his role is characterized as spouse.
Okay, so now I have three reification. I have three objects. That seems to represent a marriage. I have now 3.
Well, that's an
Reified.
example of a role where this responsibility is not required, all likely.
Yeah.
Because you're right, it's more complicated and it's not
So,
useful.
so where does,
In that particular case, though, in that particular case, given that there's the marriage is a a reflexive relationship, you could say both Joe and Mary, where the marriage is performed by Joe and Mary, it applies to the marriage itself, and they are performing the role of spouse.
right, that's the case where you have only one role, because they're
Right.
both playing the same role, but suppose it's like legal guardian. So there are 2 people on on each end, and one is playing the role of guardian and one is playing the role of whatever that is called. So if you stick the roles, so you're saying there are 2 responsibilities then?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so there is 1 guardianship and 2 responsibilities, or
Mhm.
just, so you've
Right.
got now 3
So-
temporal,
so-
you've
well,
got now
so
3
let's-
temporal relationships.
Um,
And
well, let's back up. So, if the legal guardianship, okay, the would apply to the child X. It's performed by adult Y, okay, with some start and stop date, and that guardianship is characterized as the role as legal guardian. Okay, now, so that's one temporal relation.
Mhm.
Where are you getting 3?
okay, there are 2 then. There are 2 temporal relations, correct? Because there are 2 different roles.
What are the roles?
Guardian and whatever the ruler is saying, guarded, or the person who's.
Okay.
Okay,
But-
so then, as far as I can see, you have 2 responsibilities, each with a role, but then don't you want to link those responsibilities to one another? Do you want to leave them completely unlinked?
It
If
would all
you want
depend on
to,
it would depend on your requirements.
well, that's where I
Generally,
get, that's where I
generally
get,
speaking, generally speaking, we're not, in the legal guardianship kind of thing, we're not usually looking at it from the role of the guarded, although I'm sure if we were writing an ontology for a child welfare organization, we definitely would. So yes, potentially, depending on the nature of the role, you might wind up with 2 different temporal relations.
And-
But you might not.
but then if you have 2, it really seems to me that there has to be some link between the 2, because otherwise, the dates on each responsibility are always going to be identical. In order to keep the alignments, you need a 3rd temporal relation, which, so
Or
that's
you
how I
just-
get, that's how I'm getting 3 instead
Okay,
of 1.
so what I would just say you would have instead an object property to link between the 2 temporal things.
I think that's, yeah, I think that would
Just to
work.
assert, this is related to, or
Yeah,
inverted, inverse
Exactly.
relationship of, or
Yeah.
what have you.
okay.
Okay, next up.
Matt Johnson.
Yeah, this is kind of related to what she was saying. This is just more of a comment, which might be totally obvious, in which case I'm sorry. But I think the value of kind of this, pattern kind of comes back to when do you need to capture the temporality, is that this is doing exactly what under the covers, you mentioned reify before, it's what RDF statement, does, where it's not just temporality, it's provenance, it's really any other statement if you want to make about a statement that, or any statement you want to make about a triple, can be applied in here. So in that question that she was just asking about, you know, how many temporal relations do you need? It really kind of comes back to where do you need to capture temporality? And if you don't need it, be simple, just have a direct triple. But you know, there's frequently you're going to convince yourself, you know, I need a temporal relation called guardianship, and then I need two different temporal relations to actually represent the roles, because each of those can change in time. And so it all kind of comes down to I mean, you end up with more triples, but you end up with more power. You end up with more, you know, unless we're dealing with property graphs, you can't make, you know, you have to reify it.
But you're, just to follow up, you're still missing the fact that there's a link between those two responsibilities. So if one ends, the other has to end.
Well,
And
what I think way I'm understanding you, I would almost say that the guardianship is the link between the two. And that kind of goes back to, should there be super properties that allow you to build a property chain to actually traverse that relationship? But I might be misvisualizing the use case you've got.
And I would also kind of muddy the waters a little bit here by saying that while I have found that the is performed by and applies to pair of properties works pretty well in most of the cases that I've run across involving using a role, it does not mean that you couldn't come up with something that would allow you to say, to have both the guardian and the guarded child, you know, on the same responsibility relation. You know, it would just take a while to figure out how you want to state that. And, you know, would it be generic enough that it could be reused, or was it important enough to be specific to the case that you have? So, you know, all of this is carved in Jello. You know, you should, you know, understand that right now I'm throwing out something just to hopefully make things easier for you when you tread lightly down the road of roles, but you know, don't take this as being carved in stone.
Very good. Well, that brings us right to the top of the hour.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Very much appreciate it.
thank you, Dan.
Bye, Dan.
Thank
Yeah, it's
you.
really interesting.
Yeah, good.
This is really interesting.
Very interesting.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Super.
Bye.
Good. Thanks, everybody.